Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. Hello, we are in Magdalen College at the University of Oxford. With me is Professor Robert Gilbert, who is a fellow here at Magdalen, the Professor of Biophysics at the Nuffield Department of Medicine and Director of the University of Oxford's Medical Sciences Graduate School. Thank you, Professor Gilbert, for joining us on this episode of Phil-Sci-Theo. Could you begin by telling us a bit about your research?
Sure, thank you, Buki. So I am a structural biologist, and what that means is that we use methods which include X-ray crystallography, which is well known because of its key role in discovering many of the molecular processes underpinning life, such as how hemoglobin works and how DNA is structured. X-ray crystallography and also electron microscopy to image biomolecules, and that gives us an idea of the 3D chemistry, if you like, of processes. And it's something we can use to study life at all scales, really, right from the individual molecules, individual proteins and bits of nucleic acid up to whole cells and potentially beyond into the organismal level. So it's a process of studying biology which has a kind of extension in 3D space, but also we can look at how things proceed in time. And so in the context of this conversation, what's quite interesting for me and for the way my own thinking has developed is that it's quite a visual science, and it involves, therefore, visual appreciation of the 3D shape of molecules, the 3D chemistry by which they carry out their functions.
Thank you, because that leads nicely to the next question. You are a scientist and you're also a priest in the Church of England. As someone who is currently undertaking doctoral research in science and religion, people often ask me if there isn't a tension between science and religion. Do you see a tension, and how do you handle such a tension?
So I think clearly there are tensions. I think those tensions arise really from misunderstanding of what the two activities are trying to achieve or what they're really focused on. Science is clearly engaged in an attempt to get as objective understanding as we possibly can about the way the world works. And we can do that at different levels. I've already given an example of the way I do it at the kind of molecular level. We can do it at the level of speciation or disease dynamics. We can do it at the level of making better batteries. We can do it at all sorts of levels. But it's about trying to understand the world and then use our understanding to, I guess, make the world more to manipulate the world, to make the world easier to live in for us, to use the world for our good and the good of others, to make the world a place in which all people can thrive, if you're being idealistic, and many scientists would be. So it's something which is very practical and focused on those outcomes. Whereas religion, religious practice, faith, they are about something far more fundamental, really. It's something to do with, obviously, what we're doing here, what our purpose in life is as people. And the curious thing, in fact, is that while quite often people will talk about how, or imagine that the confrontation between science and religion has resulted in science, if you like, undermining some of the claims religions or people of faith would make, in truth, there's a sense in which science and scientists depend on many of the attitudes that religious people employ in their faith lives. Most obviously, actually, science depends on some articles of faith, that we can understand the world, which is actually not something which is something that can be taken for granted, actually. There's no particular reason to suppose that humans would have evolved to be able to understand the world in the way it is, and to be able to understand it with the detail and accuracy we can. This is an argument very well associated with Plantinga, but also people like Thomas Nagel, who, of course, is not a theist. But it's an important argument alongside arguments about whether we can understand the basis for moral activity, for example. And again, moral activity is something which scientists need to follow. They need to believe in a truth. They need to believe that the truthful is better than the false. And that's, again, a kind of article of faith, which it's It's not obvious human beings should have evolved to track the truth, but we have. So curiously enough, although there is a perception of conflict, what it comes down to really is a misapplication of religion or religious practice, as if religions are trying to challenge science on what they're trying to do, and in fact they're trying to do quite different things. Clearly, religion is not trying to provide mechanical explanations of how the world works. It's much more about enabling us to understand who we are, how we relate to creation, and particularly to the Creator.
It raises a question for me on there is a critique of science that I've heard, probably one of the strongest critiques I've heard, that there is something about how science is practiced, or some of the assumptions in sciences that come from religion. So the idea of purpose, the idea of directionality, the idea that there is something rationally understandable about the world. I wonder what you think about that.
That's very interesting. What I think about that is, what I think about it is that I might turn it around again and say that I can see where those criticisms are coming from, because they might say that you're imputing into the world aspects of meaning that aren't there, and if you want to take the view that the world is meaningless, then you could accuse scientists of operating with a false framework if they are acting as if the world is meaningful. What I would say is that it is not trivial. I think it's really not a trivial fact that a meaningful approach to the world as meaningful is so fruitful in science. So, the fact is that scientists, yes, of course, they are for themselves where they are, intuiting what they can, coming up with the models that they can, the hypotheses they can, testing them in the way they can, and their experimental design is obviously impacted by their vision of the world as meaningful, and that experiments are somehow testing a process which is logical, which I suppose is an aspect of meaning. But the fact is that, when you, out of your science, are able to design a drug which stops people from dying, that's not something about a false perception of meaning. That's about the fact that your attitude, your assumption of meaning delivered you something which enabled you to change how the world works. And now, because you're giving somebody a particular drug which has been designed based on the insights you had scientifically, you stop them from dying. That is not something that is trivial. It's not something which is about a false perception of meaning. And just to be clear, obviously one could test any number of chemicals, for example, to develop a drug, and you could see that as a random process where you might stumble across one that works. That's not how it works. That's not how the operation is carried out. It's a logical process, a process which assumes meaning on the local scale, at least. And I suppose what I'd say is, not only is meaning applicable on the local scale of the molecule, we also find it applicable, for example, on the grand scale in terms of understanding space-time and the kinds of insights that cosmologists and mathematical physicists can acquire from that, which is then also relevant to how we develop new tools and understand how we might, for example, engage in space travel. So I don't think that it's trivial that we impute meaning. I think actually you could argue that the fact that an assumption of meaningfulness in the world is so fruitful for the scientist raises serious questions for somebody who wishes to see the world as meaningless.
This discussion series, as you know, is in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion. Your book, Science and Truthfulness of Beauty, published in 2018, addresses some of these topics. A question you consider in your book is this: when scientists describe their results or insights as beautiful, are they using the term differently from when they use it of a landscape, music, or another person? How do you address this?
I address it by ultimately reflecting that when we talk about beauty, we are not talking about a property which is primarily inherent in the thing we're describing. We're primarily talking about our response to it. And that's the critical position I'm coming from. Of course, there are features of things that people say are beautiful which are common, or there are some common features they share. Sometimes they are symmetrical, Sometimes they are fundamentally not symmetrical, and that's the point. Sometimes they have particular combinations of hues. In other times they might have combinations of hues which many people would consider unattractive, but for some reason they work from a particular perspective. When it comes to music, certain tonal relationships have classically been heard as beautiful, but we can learn to find beauty in tonal relationships which are not obviously to the kind of uneducated ear necessarily attractive. My point is that it's how we respond that's really important here. And so taking that as read, that it's how our response which is fundamental, I suppose that means then that really what I'm saying is that no, there is not a fundamental difference, because I think that the perception of beauty is something that appears to be inherent to human beings. It seems to be something which we have from pre-verbal days onwards, and from pre-verbal days onwards it has certain kinds of properties. So from pre-verbal days, before we can speak, we can classify things by similar shapes and colours. And we build on that in ways in which we then later learn how to classify mathematically or scientifically, to classify images using advanced image analysis software. I don't actually think, in a sense, that those are fundamentally different processes. They're operating with different levels of sophistication and skill and potentially understanding, but they are not fundamentally different processes. We're still comparing and contrasting and grouping by similarity, and that's one form of appreciation of the beauty or the nature of things. I think that when we say that something is beautiful, as I say, it's our response that's critical. When we do say that we think something is beautiful, it's a shorthand for saying how wonderful this thing is what it is. And so it therefore is also a shorthand for declaring that we, in a sense, love it. And so I think that just the use of the word beauty as a shorthand is a way of saying, I love this thing that I've observed. And there's a famous quotation which has been used by various writers and thinkers from Josef Pieper, who points out that he talks about this experience of beauty and love as saying how wonderful something exists. This person, this diatom, he says, and he's talking about a common process of ecstasy, really, of the existence of something else. One thing I've been thinking about recently that relates to this is that people will obviously comment, well, isn't beauty in the eye of the beholder? It's about your tastes and how you've developed and been brought up and so on. Well, of course that's the case, about the culture you grew up in. Of course that is the case. That's why I say it's your response that matters, not the property that the thing that you're responding to. And the reason why I bring up taste here is that somebody might think that a particular painting, say, or another piece of artwork is tasteless. They might think it a bit garish or artless. I think we should reflect on the fact that somebody else might have acquired that picture means they saw beauty in it, and that should invite us to empathy to that person and try and think about what it was they saw in it, and what tender feelings, if you like, they had towards that thing that they found lovely. If you think back to when we are little children, we do find beauty in in places that adults would think unexceptional. So we pick up shells on the seashore and they shine because they're still wet. They stop shining soon after that, but we find them beautiful, or stones or what have you, or flowers. So we actually find beauty commonplace from our childhood up. And I think similarly we find beauty wherever we look and are delighted in what we observe, whatever we love, what we find. And I just would suggest that rather than considering things maybe tasteful or tasteless, actually what matters is the fact that somebody liked it, somebody loved this, and one should really try and empathize with that perspective.
Yes. The word wonderful raised for me, really anticipates the question, a follow-on question to that. Is that response to beauty an effective response, such as wonder in something else, or is it disconnected from affect?
No, it's an effective response. It's our feeling. It's feelings we have, and of course that's one of the really striking things here. We were talking about the assumption of meaning as something which scientists might or might not have appropriately, and I was saying, well, the assumption of meaning turns out to be very fruitful. And actually, so the assumption of meaning is a kind of subjective predisposition to find the world meaningful, you could argue, or it might be argued. The effective response to say, this is a wonderful thing, that's how we feel about something. And that's what is so striking here, that scientists of all kinds, I believe, have effective responses, and those effective responses are objectively effective. They bring about proper understanding of how things actually are, of course within frameworks of testing and model refinement and so on, but nevertheless they are what drives the discoveries which turn out to be truthful and which enable us to improve the world for ourselves and for others, we hope.